Welcome everybody for our second day of the Symposium of Borders and Perspectives. We had two great talks yesterday, and we have two more to come today. I think one of the big important things that came out of yesterday's discussion and the talks is the importance of Latin American studies, right? Not only to the mission of the university, but to projects such as civic engagement and activism. That Latin American studies is really not built on a series of platitudes, right? It's actually very much on the ground and engaged. Before we go to the next talks, I'm going to go through a list of contributors to the program. There's actually a long list. Yeah, I'll try to spare you the list feeling of that. But we have, as I said, two more talks today. There's no question and answer after the talks, but instead there'll be a panel discussion with all speakers. So we'll hold off until then for a discussion. So to give verbal thanks to all the people and organizations who have supported this program. With administrative assistance, I really would like to thank Terry Johnson, Catherine Hooker, Allison Fannin, and Kelly Lessard for their great work behind the scenes. Again, to our student committee, Tori Vasquez, Guillermo Alvarado, and Meili Crezis. To the Latin American Studies Committee, Carlos de Oro, Laura Senio Blair, Angeles Rodriguez Cadena, Eric Selvin, Omar Rivera, and Michael Bray. And especially, again, to Eric Selvin and Omar Rivera for pulling a lot of the heavy weight at the beginning of this and getting this going. I'd like to also welcome our newest faculty member, who's not yet part of the committee, but we expect him and hope he will be part of it very soon, Jethro Hernandez Barones. Welcome. And to all the contributors, there's a long list. The Provost and Dean of Faculty, number one here, for greatest contribution at least. The Americas North by South Paideia that I introduced yesterday. Global Citizens Funds, student organizations such as Latinos Unidos and Kappa Delta Chi, campus committees and offices, the Coalition for Diversity and Social Justice, the Diversity Enrichment Committee, the Office of Diversity Education, and the Parent and Alumni Relations. Departments and programs that have contributed include political science, philosophy, race and ethnicity studies, sociology and anthropology, history, Spanish, feminist studies, and international studies. So quite a list there of quite a number of people who have really brought this together. So with that, I'll leave it to Melissa Johnson, who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. It is my absolute honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Santiago Guerra to you. Santiago is a 2004 alum of Southwestern University. He was here before anthropology was really fully coalesced as a program, got a major in Chicano studies, but anthropology was his discipline. He then went on to UT to get a PhD in anthropology. He's now an assistant professor of Southwest Studies at Colorado College. I've known him since he was a student, and he blew my mind when he was a student, and he continues to blow my mind today. He's an up-and-coming scholar, up-and-coming leader in the Anthropology Association nationally, and I think he's going to transform the discipline. I really do think that, Chago. And also is becoming a leading scholar in the anthropology of drugs. He will ask provoking questions, as you might have heard if you were here yesterday. He already started that. And so his research is on drug trafficking on the border, on cannabis use and politics in Colorado, and other things as well. And with that, please join me in listening to this wonderful young man.
And so the focus of my talk today is to try to think about how policy really changes not just policing and the way drug laws are enforced throughout the Americas, but to think about how policy actually transforms drug trafficking and how it's actually led to a lot of the problems that we continue to try to deal with in the contemporary period, right? And so if we take sort of a historical and ethnographic approach, we can actually document how some of these changes are taking place. Because of sort of time and because of the way ethnography sort of, transmits itself orally, I won't have enough time to do a lot of the ethnographic stuff. So this is mostly going to be a talk about policy and its effects, right? So, before we get started, my research on drug trafficking actually started while I was a student at Southwestern. It was actually the basis for my thesis in my final year here. Prior to that, I worked on an environmental justice project with Dr. Melissa Johnson, Dr. Emily Niemeyer, Dr. Laura Hobgood-Oster, and we went down to Matamoros and we studied the impact of migration, of the effects of maquiladoras as a result of NAFTA, and a lot of the environmental contamination that was taking place in this shanty town in Matamoros. And I thought from that point that the focus of my work was going to be thinking about the political economic effects of migration on the US-Mexico border. That all changed and started to sort of coalesce into a research agenda while here at CC. And it started as soon as I got to campus, because within hours of arriving on campus, my family was helping me move in, and they quickly had to depart because one of my cousins was actually caught transporting just over 2,000 pounds of marijuana across the US-Mexico border, right? In that initial stage, I really didn't think about it much, but in my third year here at Southwestern, a white student who was my neighbor in these sort of mock apartments here on campus was actually caught dealing marijuana out of his apartment. And what transpired just after this event was what really got me to think about researching drugs in this sort of social justice-oriented framework. And what took place is that the campus community rallied in his defense, right? And they talked about how these draconian drug laws were affecting communities. And one thing that I left out is that in the whole time here at Southwestern, my cousin, who I mentioned earlier, was held in detention at the federal facility down in Taylor. And so I would visit him periodically on weekends. And so this moment here at Southwestern in my third year really opened my eyes to sort of the injustices of how the war on drugs is exercised across the Americas, right? How you can have folks rally in the defense of this, young white male student who had so much promise and all these, dreams that could have been crushed, right? And in the end, he really didn't suffer any of the repercussions of his actions, right? And my entire question was, what about all those young men at the detention facility down in Taylor, who are mostly there for the same type of crimes? And there's a reason why this takes place, right? We've constructed the war on drugs in a certain way, and a lot of that comes out of particular ways in which policy and policing serves to reinforce the agendas of the nation state, right? So I'm going to try to do a little of theoretical work before getting into the actual content. Some scholars in the anthropology of drugs have started to develop these ideas around what we've been referring to as narcopolitics, right? The ideas around the political acts and the political repercussions of prohibiting particular substances that we come to recognize as drugs, right? The leading sort of authority in this field and sort of theorizes to the greatest extent, William Garriott, focuses on how narcopolitics is not about controlling people, it's about controlling substances. And in my analysis, I really disagree with that, right? Because if we look at the historical material and the ethnographic material and the social reality of how drug laws are enforced, right, it's really about controlling people, right, controlling territory, and controlling life, right? And because we're talking about controlling life, right, we have to talk about biopolitics, right? And so this is like, the accessible version of Foucault, as accessible as I can think of making it, right? But what biopolitics really refers to, right, is a system of governance that regulates and controls populations through what Foucault refers to as biopower, right? And biopower are the technologies and the techniques that enable the nation state to exert control over its population. And aside from that, biopower is significantly invested in life in order to produce and maintain a healthy and vigorous population. That is to say, we try to get rid of those elements that are a threat to maintaining life, right? Now, if we think about drug laws in this sort of theoretical framework, we really start to understand how that situation I just mentioned earlier is able to unfold, right? Because whose lives are we valuing in that scenario, right? Not the lives of my cousins or these individuals along the border or in Mexico, right? Right. We protect drug consumers at the expense of drug producers and drug traffickers, right? All right, so drug policy inevitably leads to a particular type of outcome, right? And the way we've seen drug policy created and crafted, it creates new social and material conditions that we then have to craft new policy to deal with these new material and social conditions for, right? And so the drug policy process is an ongoing system of trying to exercise social control, right? We target people versus substance, as opposed to what some of the drug anthropologists would have you believe. We target some places over others, right? We go primarily into urban areas as opposed to the suburbs, right? We target Latin America right vigorously, and we've dramatically changed the entire landscape in Latin America as a result of our history of drug policy. And then what's most pertinent to this discussion is that drug policies and drug discourses really serve to construct the enemies of the war on drugs, right? And so when we talk about the enemies of the war on drugs, we're not talking about my neighbor right here at Southwestern, right? We're talking about young men like my cousin, right? People like El Chapo, right? Right? People like Pablo Escobar, right? All these individuals that we hear and we know these are bad guys, right? So we create this dichotomy of good guys versus bad guys, right? And to bring in just briefly some of the work that I'm doing now in terms of cannabis regulation in Colorado, right? Their whole platform around why marijuana needed to be regulated was the fact that these criminal brown people in Mexico are getting all the money from marijuana. And wouldn't you rather these white, respectable businessmen in the state of Colorado have that money to build schools for your communities, right? So even in a platform of drug policy reform, we have these same sort of racialized ideas about who the bad guys are in terms of drug production and drug consumption, right? So historically, the targets of the war on drugs are Latin Americans, but now increasingly, because of changes to the drug trafficking landscape as a result of this policy, now when we talk about the effects of drug trafficking and the targets of drug policy, we're talking about Mexicans and we're talking about Mexico, right? We started to see now, because of the effects of Mexican drug trafficking organizations, that even that is starting to bleed into Central America, right? Places like El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, right? So how does drug policy change trafficking, right? It doesn't happen all at once, right? This is a historical process that leads us into the present, right? Where, right, if you've seen any sort of action movie in recent years, it seems like in more and more of those movies, who are the bad guys, right? Mexican drug traffickers. You see movies like Two Guns, right? Things like Breaking Bad, right? All these elements of popular culture are signaling this very change taking place, right? So as a result of our drug policy, right, we create new forms of policing. Increasingly, these types of policing measures are targeted, right, spatially targeted, population targeted, and they're militarized, right? Now, as a result of this border policing taking on this new militarized form in both the US and in Mexico, we've seen the border become a militarized zone, right? Now, that creates all sorts of new sort of realities for drug traffickers along the border and throughout Latin America, right? So if the policing bodies adopt militarized tactics, guess what drug trafficking organizations do? Adopt the very same tactics, right? So now drug trafficking organizations are innovative, they're coercive, and they're increasingly violent. All right, so now we get into the meat of the historical material, right? in this discussion, right, we have to begin in 1848 when we designate the Texas-Mexico border our sort of new boundary marker for the nation state, right? Now, in this initial period, we see the growth of smuggling, right? Smuggling, right, and in all sorts of goods, right, all sorts of contraband becomes an important economic practice along the U.S.-Mexico border, and it's something that we see sort of globally, right, where borders become important places to undermine, the imposition of tariffs, right, the imposition of restriction on certain goods, right. In the contraband era, right, the goods that are trafficked aren't necessarily, right, any of these things that the state sort of deems are dangerous, right? In a lot of cases, as in, both world wars, for example, right, we had rationing in the US. Guess what? Our neighbors to the south helped provide a lot of the goods that were being rationed, right? Go back even further back in time, right? During the Civil War, because of the boycott, right, on Confederate cotton, they found a way to smuggle cotton out of Texas into Mexico, right, back across the Atlantic to ready and available markets, right? So we have to think about drug trafficking within this history, this longer history of smuggling, right? In the initial period, we see a lot of families start to develop an entire livelihood around the smuggling of whatever goods are available, right? Things like textiles, right? The first narco corrido that if we can call it that, of somebody smuggling goods across the U.S.-Mexico border. Mariano Resendes in the South Texas border region was a textile smuggler, right? He died for smuggling textiles, right? This is documented in both popular culture and also historical materials. But then something changes, right? And that is we begin prohibitive policy around particular substances, right? In 1914, we have the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, and that effectively begins to outlaw a lot of the drugs that we now sort of associate as the hard narcotics, right? Things like heroin and cocaine, right? We flash forward a little bit, right? So as we see 1914 have the passage of this act, we start to see smuggling groups already move into smuggling heroin and cocaine, right? We get to 1919 and the 18th Amendment, right? Alcohol prohibition really sparks the growth of these smuggling organizations, right? The first drug smuggling organizations that become truly powerful are these alcohol smugglers, right? Los tequileros, as they're referred to, in Spanish. And they really become quite, profitable and quite powerful in just the act of, right, smuggling this prohibited substance, right? But then, right, we repeal prohibition, right? 1933, the 21st Amendment, cuts off a lot of the income source for these smugglers, right? But we don't leave them completely empty-handed because just a few years later, we have the Marijuana Tax Act. So, right, the government gives, the government takes away, and they give again, right? And so now, right, this really sets up this sort of what we can call the trinity of drug trafficking. Heroin, cocaine, marijuana really sets up the social circumstances for these drug trafficking organizations to grow to this large scale that we start to see by the 1980s and 90s, right? And so this is the type of shifts we see early on, right? Prior to any sort of declaration of a war on drugs, right? And it allows for smugglers along the border to really see the profitability of drug trafficking, or drug smuggling at this point, right? And then we see the birth of the drug war, right? And we don't just see this here federally, right? We see this internationally, because if we look back to 1961, we have the first UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, right? Everybody know that Uruguay is the first country to legally legalize the production, sale, and consumption of marijuana, right? there's a reason, because they're not bound to these international conventions on drug prohibition, right? So in 1961, we have the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. In 1969, as a prelude to the official launch of the war on drugs in the US, we have Operation Intercept, right? And what Operation Intercept did is that it was the first large-scale targeting of the US-Mexico border, right? All ports of entry were given, right, new numbers of manpower to be able to revise more and more, vehicles coming across into the U.S., right? I've done a lot of oral history work with some of the older smugglers, and they said prior to Operation Intercept, they could bring stuff over without any real problem, right? They would come across, they take, right, if you know the Rio Grande Valley at that time, right, it's around the time of the Texas, farm worker strike. They would actually take a lot of the farm trucks, right, that they would use to transport, things like watermelon, onion, down in the Rio Grande Valley, take them over into Mexico, load them up with marijuana, drive them across the river, right, distribute them into smaller loads and send them up to the counterculture kids, maybe here at Southwestern, especially down at UT Austin. And so it was a really, really sort of simple process, right? Operation Intercept changes all that, because as traffickers start to recognize that they're about to experience a new level of surveillance, right, and policing, they completely reformulate their smuggling practices, right? In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act really marks the launch of the war on drugs because it establishes the types of penalties for possession, transport of these substances, right? And then in 1971, right, we make the boneheaded mistake of signing on to an international agreement to basically prohibit and fight a war against all of these substances, right? That still binds us to this day, right? And so we can't legally, right? People like to talk about how Colorado sort of is in violation of federal law with their legalization. They're actually in violation of international law as well, right? And then in 1973, we have the establishment of the DEA, and that results in all sorts of new problems, right? In the 1960s, as a result of the UN conventions, we see the breakup of the French Connection, right? Prior to this, most of the heroin in the US came from Southeast Asia, right, or the Far East. And all that came across, right, the Atlantic, right, through a group of French smugglers. We target that. We're able to use the UN conventions to be able to target that system of smuggling into the US. So we cut off the supply of smuggling from overseas. We eradicate the East Coast Florida trafficking route for cocaine, right? If you remember the history of trying to target, right, Escobar, right, and all these sort of conflicts in Colombia, right, that sort of undid the access to those two substances, right? What ends up taking place is that these policies actually redirect, right, the smuggling of these goods into Mexico, right? And that's when we see the greatest change to Mexican drug trafficking organizations, because now they're not just working with some marijuana, right, a little bit of heroin. Now they're working with a substance that's increasingly popular and especially more profitable, right? And then this last stage is sort of the contemporary stage we're in, right? This is what I call the American securitization, Mexican militarization moment, right? So after September 11th, right, we have this sort of renewed emphasis in thinking about drug trafficking as an issue of homeland security, right? So we frame the protection of the U.S. from drugs as, all right, drug trafficking organizations are now increasingly violent. They increasingly resort to all sorts of new types of criminal enterprises. They could, right, resort to bringing in members of Al-Qaeda, right, taking some sort of bribe for that, right? So that really sets up the impetus for how we now exert power over Mexico, right? And this really comes into play with the Calderon administration because the Calderon administration really militarizes the war on drugs in Mexico, right? People like to call it Mexico's war on drugs. That's another discursive tool to try to relieve blame from ourselves, right? But we are actually the chief architects of what's taking place under Calderon, right? Because part of why they were able to get him to militarize the drug war in Mexico is this thing right here, right? The Mérida Initiative, right? What's often referred to as Ban Mexico. What the Mérida Initiative did is that it provided an incentive for the militarization of the drug war in Mexico, right? It's a $1.6 billion award package to Mexico to be able to fight this war on drugs, right? The issue was that prior to this, Mexico was trying to find other ways to combat the war on drugs. And part of what they did was that they decriminalized the possession of certain amounts of these substances, right? In an effort to try to, right, pull back some of the restrictions and some of the targeting of these populations, right? That really upset the American government, right? And so this emphasis on militarization really starts to sweeten the deal, right? And this huge award package around military money sets up that imperative, right? And then the last part of it is this renewed emphasis on capo, capture, and extradition, right? We see as part of this, right, Ociel Cárdenas Guillén, the leader of the Gulf Cartel, right, captured, extradited, right? In Mexico City, the Beltrán Leiva brothers, right, are targeted. A lot of the individuals, right, more recently, right, those of you from Laredo, La Barbie, right, gets captured and extradited. And then, right, the most infamous of all drug traffickers, the one no one can catch, right, finally gets caught, El Chapo Guzman, right, worth more money than everyone in the world put together, it seems like, right, gets captured, right. That has significant effects, right. That policy creates all these new sort of alignments within Mexico. And some of these effects are, right, the militarization of Mexican drug trafficking, right. We see the birth of Los Zetas, right, a group that's actually trained using U.S. drug policy money, right. They're trained as an anti-drug task force. They're part of a special division of the Mexican Special Forces, right. They get quickly bought out by Ociel Cárdenas Guillén and told, hey, I need a military. Y'all seem to be the best available soldiers in this nation, right? I'll take y'all. Name your price, right? That leads to the consolidation of power in organizations, right? And also, right, because Los Zetas are so effective, everybody wants to have their own group like Los Zetas, so everyone starts to militarize. We have a group like Los Negros in Sinaloa, right? Los Pelones, right? All these groups develop to try to emulate what Los Zetas are doing, right? And at that point, Los Zetas, right, in 2007, 2008, they're still able to work under the directorship of a strong leader. Because we target their capo, right, it creates all sorts of problems with allegiance for their organization. And so eventually Los Zetas break off from the Gulf Cartel and eventually take control of just about half of Mexico, right? Aside from that, we see the expansion of organizations' criminal activity into things like, right, oil smuggling, things like immigrant smuggling, right? If you heard back to right around the time that this sort of split between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas takes place, we hear about the San Fernando massacre, right? Where dozens of immigrants from Central America and Mexico are basically massacred for not sort of giving into the will of these drug trafficking organizations, right? And then we have especially the targeted recruitment of young people, right? Los Zetas start to set up training camps, right? They start to recruit young people to be sicarios, right? To be lookouts, all these things, right? And so we see gradually drug trafficking organizations become powerful as a result of our efforts to undermine their activities, right? And all this is taking place at a point in time where drug consumption in the US remains pretty much stable, right? And one other thing is taking place in the US and why Los Zetas become so powerful, right? To critique the folks that I study in terms of the legalization efforts, right? The legalization of both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana along, right, the western half of the United States actually redirects most marijuana trafficking from Mexico through Texas and to the eastern portion of the United States, and especially parts in the South, right, which don't have any hope of legalizing the substance anytime in the near future, right? So drug policy has an effect on these type of things, right? And then probably the most important thing to talk about when we talk about the effects of drug policy on society, right, and on the border, right? If any of you are familiar with these hashtags, right, this is part of an ongoing crisis in Mexico, right, where 43 students from La Escuela Normal in Ayotzinapa were disappeared, right? And in the process of trying to find these young people, right, they've uncovered all these mass graves throughout southern Mexico, right? And every time they uncover a new grave and they do the forensic analysis, they figure out these are not the students, right? But those are some people that, right, have been exterminated as a result of the rise of drug trafficking organizations, right? And the state that has the most narcofosas, or these graves that have been discovered, is the state of Tamaulipas, right, with which we share the greatest border, right? And so we had in Mexico, right, in the last week, this call to action, right? We have Mexicans, right, fed up, right? These hashtags, Ayotzinapa, México lindo y herido, vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos, todos somos Ayotzinapa, right? Hashtag for el Estado is probably the most important one because there's some truth to this, right? It was the state who was complicit in having them disappear, but it's also, right, the state more generally, right? The effects of policy and prohibition that have led to these sort of types of organizations being able to exercise this type of power. And then the last one, which is probably most important, ya me cansé, right? That is to say, we're fed up. And this is really important because we do not have a real emphasis on drug policy reform in the US, right? We have a few sort of rumblings of marijuana legalization here and there, but there isn't a concerted effort to try to undo the years and years worth of prohibition that have led to all of this, right? And in sort of wrapping up this talk, I want to sort of leave you with, it isn't simply the bad guys, right, that are going down for all of these changes that have taken place, right? We shouldn't necessarily think about this as, right, drug traffickers are bad, we as honest citizens are good, right? Because everyone is complicit in this taking place, right? If you're not politically active as someone who makes an effort to fight this, if you're a drug consumer, right? You know, I often talk to my students about, you know, if you consume any of these substances, right, on an illicit market, you're contributing to this type of perpetuation, right, and growth of these types of industries. Would you give that up until this problem is resolved? Most of them say no, right? And so we're complicit, all of us, in the fact that this has been allowed to go on as long as it has, right? And just in case you think, okay, well, why should we care? Because I am an anthropologist, I'm going to end with a little bit of ethnography, just to try to drive the point home, that it isn't just these bad guys that are affected by this, right? All right, so right, as a matter of historical context to talk about something that took place, right? On May 20th, 1997, 18-year-old student Ezequiel Hernandez was shot and killed by U.S. Marines in the West Texas border town of Redford. The Marines that killed Hernandez were part of a joint task force operating between the U.S. military and U.S. Border Patrol. Their mission was to implement new intelligence gathering and policing strategies as part of the escalating war on drugs. Hernandez was shot because he was mistaken for being a drug trafficker and possible threat to the Marines, while he was herding his goats and carrying a .22 caliber rifle. He was the first American civilian killed by the U.S. military while on duty since the Kent State killings of 1970, right? Less than a year later, in March 1998, two young men were traveling through Rio Grande City at midnight in a white Ford pickup along U.S. Highway 83, which runs parallel to the Rio Grande River. Without warning, the young men were ambushed by several county sheriff's units, Rio Grande police chief officers, and border patrol units. The two young men, one 17, the other 15, were held at gunpoint by authorities for several minutes until it was determined that they posed no threat. The lead officer stated that, quote, they fit the description of a vehicle of interest. That is to say, there was a white Ford pickup that had been seen fleeing from the river that was purported to be in possession of large quantities of marijuana. So after the excessive show of force, the 17-year-old was released, and the 15-year-old was detained for a city curfew violation. Now, I'd like to say that this is something that's uncommon, right? But I still collect these type of stories from young men about the same ages in Rio Grande City, right? And typically, they match the description of, it's a similar vehicle, right? We thought you were carrying drugs. They're always held at gunpoint, right? So the effects of trying to control these substances have dramatic repercussions for people along the border. And just so you know, it isn't some kid, somewhere out there, the 15-year-old was me, right? Thank you.